I'm Sally Warhaft, and it is an enormous pleasure to welcome Mona Eltahawy here to Melbourne, to the Wheeler Centre for her only Melbourne event. And of course, I'm sure you all know who she is. She's an award-winning journalist, columnist, speaker on Egypt and the Arab world and women. Her work has been published, well, everywhere, and she's described herself as an extremist liberal feminist, which we'll get to as we get into our conversation. Mona's currently living back in Cairo. She's on her way back there via a couple of other places pretty soon, but it is a great pleasure to please welcome Mona Eltahawy. Before we start talking about the issues that you're most concerned about with women, I wanted to ask you about Egypt right now. We did a session on the Fifth Estate a couple of weeks ago with the Lowy Institute, and which is a think tank here in Australia, an independent think tank, and the Middle East expert came back from Egypt. He'd come back that week, and he'd travelled elsewhere as well, and he said, nowhere in the world is frightening me like Egypt at the moment. He said, it feels like it's about to erupt, and the world has taken its eyes off it. Tell us how you think it's tracking.
Well, I mean, as I said on Q&A yesterday, we're kind of fucked right now. It's not an easy time. And I think the fact that it's not an easy time speaks to the level of challenge that the regime feels that the revolution has represented to it. The fact that the military-backed regime, the military basically, feels it has to imprison so many opponents, silence so many journalists, including one of your own and the Al Jazeera crew, and put into jail everyone along a very, very vast spectrum, from the Islamists of the Muslim Brotherhood, the more secular activists of various political backgrounds, who often have very little in common with each other. I think that all speaks to this very deep-seated panic that they have, that basically says something fundamental has changed in enough Egyptians that it's worrying them. And that's what keeps me optimistic. For the past 60 years, we've been stuck between this very false choice in Egypt between the military, which for me represents military fascism, and Islamists, which for me represents religious fascism. And we're constantly called upon in Egypt to choose between the two, and it's a false choice. And we've had very few alternatives, because another thing the regime has done throughout those 60 years is make sure that we haven't had any alternatives. So another thing the revolution has done is to try to create those alternatives, but obviously we need time. We can't dismantle 60 years of military rule in just 3 years. So yes, the world has taken its eyes off. The world is very impatient. But the world, I think as well, is too eager to say things like, oh, those Arabs don't know how to be free. Those Arabs don't want to be free. Those Egyptians love their pharaohs. You know, all the stereotypes come out. And, you know, yes, we love pharaohs, and I have an ancient Egyptian goddess in my arm, but we also want to be free. We also want to live good, decent lives. And that's why the chant of the revolution were bread, liberty, social justice, and social dignity. So, I mean, it distresses me that the world has turned off, but it continues. You know, the fight continues. Every week there's a strike by some group or other, transit workers, physicians, pharmacists. Every week there's an attempt to have a protest, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood or not, even though we have a very punitive protest law right now, it's very difficult to oppose it. So whether people are paying attention or not, there's a lot of us who still believe in this revolution. And I remain optimistic by looking ahead 7 to 10 years, understanding that it's going to be quite shit for a while, but holding on to the idea that this is what you have to do to be free. It's not going to be handed to you, you know?
Why do you think 5 to 7 years is a time frame for change, for good change, when it looks like in, a couple of months' time, the military are going to be more or less back in control?
Well, the military's never gone away. That's the thing, Sally. The military never went away, because when we got rid of Mubarak, I mean, remember during those 18 days, he called in the military. And, you know, the military was, head of intelligence at the time was Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who's going to be our new president/dictator. So he didn't just come out of nowhere. And the military at the time, when they saw the protests, and they saw Mubarak, and they saw what kind of bargain that they had to strike, you know, they wisely said to Mubarak, look, the people don't want you anymore. But they also had their own interests at heart because they didn't want Mubarak's son to inherit Egypt. So people who say that they jumped onto the protests against Morsi last summer, the military also jumped onto the revolution in 2011 because it looked at the streets and said, look, we've got millions of Egyptians against you, Mubarak, so you need to go now. But the military never went anywhere. We replaced one Mubarak with 19 Mubaraks in the form of this military junta. And one of these mini Mubaraks was Sisi. And Sisi's very, very evil role, among one of many, was that he defended the so-called virginity tests against female revolutionaries. Just 2 weeks after Mubarak stepped down, when they cleared Tahrir Square, ironically enough, the day after International Women's Day. Our first International Women's Day, March 8th, 2011, a very small group of women with some men tried to protest for women's rights, were attacked, had to escape, and the next day Tahrir Square was cleared and Sisi defends these so-called virginity tests. So there was never a time where everything was great and the revolution was winning and the revolution was... So my point is, it's been a struggle from the beginning. But we stood up to the military junta. We stood up to Morsi when he came along. And I assure you, we're going to stand up to Sisi. And that's why he's filling the jails with his opponents, because he understands. On some level, the regime seems to think it can just walk in Mubarak's shoes and just continue. This is not Mubarak's Egypt, even though the regime is still there, because enough of us have sufficiently changed to form this viable opposition to him, even though we don't have our candidate yet. That's why I'm saying 5 to 7 years. We need a presidential candidate. So for the next 5 to 7 years, every presidential election that will come up, it will be Sisi against someone else, until we find a candidate who's enough of an alternative to Muslim Brotherhood, who remain popular, Sisi, who remains the military, and the rest of us trying to say, look, there is a third alternative, but we just don't have a man, because right now it's going to be a man. But a few weeks ago, for the first time in the Arab world, we had a woman leading a political opposition party. And she's actually one of my feminist mentors. And that gives me reasons for hope. It's going to take a while for her party to become a viable enough opposition to the military. But she's there. This woman, who was one of my feminist mentors, is the leader of, for the first time, a woman leading a political party in the Arab world.
You're so optimistic. It's remarkable. You've experienced actual violence, and a lot of people would have come to know you out of that event in 2011. You were beaten up by Egyptian police. Both your arms were broken. You were taken away and interrogated by Egyptian intelligence and military police. Tell us about that experience, both the violence and how that made you, Mona, feel, but also what that interrogation was like.
Right. It was actually about 2 to 3 weeks after I visited Sydney, because I was in Sydney for the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, and I was, as I remain, very optimistic about the revolution. From the outside, what happened to me, I always say, taught me consequence. Because, I've been a journalist and a writer of some shape or form for more than 20 years. And for at least 10 to 12 of those years, I was in Egypt, actively opposing the Mubarak regime through my writing and through my news coverage. And the only kind of consequence I would face then was, it wasn't a small thing, but I'd be called into state security, my phone was tapped, I'd be followed. But that was par for the course for journalists in Egypt. But when I was attacked that night, it was November, I think, 24th or 25th of 2011, I understood what that means, how words can lead to consequence. And what happened was a friend of mine, an activist friend of mine, and I joined this protest on a street that has now become an icon of the revolution called Mohammed Mahmoud. And this street, actually, I had gone to millions of times when I was a university student, because it was the street that led to the main gate of what was then the American University in Cairo campus, but the campus has since moved. So I was very familiar with that street, but it was very surreal to go into that street that night as part of this protest. Because for 4 or 5 days, the revolution had been fighting the police and the military in order to push it back away enough from Tahrir Square, because they had just launched this unprovoked attack against unarmed protesters in Tahrir. So this was the revolution pushing the security forces back. At least 40 people were killed on that street. Some bodies were dumped in rubbish bins. There were snipers positioned on various buildings around that street to deliberately target people's eyes. Several activists lost their eyes. And young boys, boys as young as 12 were ending up in the morgue, their bodies unclaimed because nobody knew who they were. So it was horrendous. I wasn't even supposed to be in Egypt for that protest. I was supposed to be, ironically enough, after a conference in Morocco in Brussels to speak at the European Union about women in revolution. But I was just every day in tears watching what was happening on Mohammed Mahmoud Street. And I just couldn't, so I just called the EU up and said, I'm sorry, I can't come. Egypt needs me. And I went back to Egypt. And as soon as I got there, I kind of spent a few hours in Tahrir Square and went to this street. And I have to say, before I went into the street, it was surreal, because you had the field hospital outside. There was a group of Egyptians watching Tahrir Square. For those of you who've gone will know that it's a roundabout, it's not a square. And there's a group of people who were standing and watching as if what was happening in Mohammed Mahmoud was a theatre. There were vendors selling popcorn and sweet potato and candy floss, and people were sitting there just eating and watching these horrors happening inside. And every now and then there'd be a rush as people tried to escape the security forces. And this path was cleared for ambulances to go to the field hospital, but also these guys were there, and I called them the motorbike angels. And we have no idea who these men were, but these were just young Egyptian men who owned mopeds and motorbikes, who just wrapped bandanas around their face and just showed up at Mohammed Mahmoud Street because they knew this was an iconic battle. And they were just waiting in line, a whole line of them, as soon as someone from our side collapsed from the tear gas, because it was unbelievable amounts of tear gas. They would just put them on the back of their motorbikes and whiz them out. So it was like watching a scene out of Dante's Inferno or something, just surreal. So my friend and I make it to the front lines, and on the front line, we were entrapped by plainclothes security. We didn't know this at the time, but they entrapped us in a shop quite close to the front line, ostensibly because we were safe there. And earlier that day, I had been groped by someone in Tahrir Square, and I turned around and smacked him. And I said, of all the fucking places that you want to grope me, you're groping me here. So I was really angry already about my body being violated. But then when we were entrapped in the shop, there was one of the guys was holding onto my phone. He was trying to take my phone away, and I was trying to kind of push him off. And then another of the guys, as we were running for cover, groped my breast. And I was like, what the hell is happening? So I punched him. I've smacked people before, but this guy, something broke in me, and I was just pummeling him. And my friend was saying, Mona, we've got to go. Mona, we've got to go. The police is coming. And I was like, no, I'm not done. There's some kind of internal rage was coming out of, I was just punching the fucking daylights out of this guy. Or maybe in my mind I was, but I was just so angry, and I was physically hurting him. And then the riot police came, and that's when we knew that they were plainclothes security, because they all fled. And I thought my friend had managed to escape because it was just me and the riot police. But I found out later that they took my friend across the street from this shop, and they held his arms behind his back and beat him in a place where he could watch them beat me, so he couldn't do anything to help me. So I was surrounded by these 5 guys, and I got to say, as a feminist, my first thought at the time was, it's just me, I'm just a woman, and these are 5 men. What possible threat does just a woman represent to these 5 men? It didn't matter. They beat the fucking daylights out of me. It was so painful. And I couldn't understand where their rage was coming from. But later, in speaking to other people, the rage, not to say that, I am Tahrir Square and I am the revolution, but honestly, our bodies became Tahrir Square for them to enact this revenge, because the police understood that we broke them on some level. So whenever they got one of us, it was time for them to physically break us. So all this rage was coming out of this riot police with these huge nightsticks. And I was covering my head, and I was just saying, enough, because what more could happen? It was just me surrounded by them. And then they took me into this no man's land, because between us and the security forces was a no man's land. And to the side, the school was on fire. Everything was orange. Everything smelled of tear gas. And inside there, they sexually assaulted me. And I've been very open about my sexual assault, and I speak about it almost mechanically, because I later found out that at least 12 other women were also sexually assaulted on that same street. But they've been unable to speak about it.
On that same night?
Same night, probably over the 4 or 5 days during which the protest happened, or the battle happened. And, I've never claimed I speak on behalf of everyone, or of anyone, even though every now and then I get, dear Mona, you don't represent me. I've never claimed to speak for anyone, because no one is voiceless. Everyone has a voice. But as these 12 women taught me, you might have a voice, but sometimes you can't express yourself, sometimes you're denied a voice, and sometimes you just don't have a platform. So I felt that because I'm a dual citizen, because I have this platform, and because for various reasons, I'm much older than many of the other women, I've been married, so in terms of Egyptian culture, I'm not the virgin who was violated, so many things that we can talk about later if you want. I just felt compelled and obliged almost to speak out about the sexual assault. But it was basically these 4 or 5 men and their hands all over my body. I was, as they were beating me, I was pulling hands out of my jeans. And at one point, I fell to the floor and I was kind of eye level with their boots. And if you remember that picture of the woman they were stomping on a couple of weeks later. And it was only when I saw her picture that I understood the magnitude of what happened to me. So I'm on the floor and I'm eye level with their boots. And something inside me said, if you don't get up now, you're going to die. And you know how when the Incredible Hulk just had to lift that car up and he just couldn't understand where he got the strength from? Something made me get up. I don't know how. And the sexual assault continued and they basically dragged me all the way to the Interior Ministry. And I saw all these men coming towards us, and it was the most bizarre scene ever because there's 4 guys with their hands all over my body and all these men watching what was happening. And I was looking at them, hoping that one of them would do anything, but their eyes were dead. And I recognized that they were from the Interior Ministry, and for them, this is just par for the course. This is exactly what was supposed to happen. Then I'm taking into this kind of tiny road that leads to the Interior Ministry where the head officer was. And he says to me, and I found out this is standard procedure. He says to me, don't worry now, I'm going to protect you. You're going to be fine. And all the while, their hands are all over my body, nothing has changed. And he points to a group of riot police standing in kind of like formation. He goes, if I wasn't here, you know what would happen to you? See those men over there? So he's threatening me with gang rape because they're all like going like this at me. And he's doing nothing to stop what is happening under his own eyes. And so he puts me behind him, I stand behind him, and he's standing like this, pretending to protect me. And they're still doing this to my body. And at one point, he moves away, and I actually held onto his jacket. Because even though he was a useless protector, I needed a body between me and these guys. And ironically enough, it only stopped when a military officer intervened. This older military guy said, take her away. And so they took me inside to the Interior Ministry where it was just hours and hours of being accused of being a spy. You live in the building of spies. You live with the Americans. You lived in Israel because I lived in Jerusalem for a while as a Reuters correspondent. But there were 2 moments that I'll share with you because I know this is getting a bit long. The same military officer, because I kept getting asked again and again, why were you there? Why were you there? And this military officer who saved me from this sexual assault, he said, why were you on the street? And I said to him, don't you understand what you're doing to the people? Did you see what happened to me? Don't you see, why are you at war with the Egyptian people? And this man, he was about 65, 70, he actually started to tear up. It was the one moment of humanity in 12 hours of detention. And then all these men, because it was men for the entire 12 hours, 6 hours Ministry of the Interior and 6 hours military intelligence, headed, as I said, by Sisi. He wasn't there physically, but at the time he was head of military intelligence. The main big guy, the guy in the nice suit who decides who stays and who goes, I was telling all the men, I've been sexually assaulted because I wanted them to see. And they would either look away or dismiss it. One guy says to me, well, it must have been very crowded. I said, actually, it wasn't. It was just me and 4 or 5 police officers. And then this one guy in the nice suit, he got very fed up and he goes to me, you know who did this to you? And I understood he was trying to play the class card, because we're very classist in Egypt. So he looked at me and he thought, she's from a good family, so I'm going to play the class card. And he says to me, you know who did this to you? These are the lowest of the low. He's talking about the riot police. And we lifted these animals up from the mud, and we scrubbed them clean and opened the door this narrow in their minds. Those are the animals who did this to you. So he thought I was going to say, yeah, these pigs. And I looked at him and I said to him, who made them live like animals in the mud? You did. And then you're surprised that we have a revolution. So I'm in this bizarre situation where I'm defending the men who sexually assaulted me against this bastard who taught them to sexually assault me.
You, after this experience, wrote a quite famous essay now for the Foreign Policy Journal titled, Why Do They Hate Us? Your thesis being that Arab men hate women, which caused great controversy and much discussion. You described it as nothing short of a war. tell us why you believe that Arab men hate women and why they're any different from other men.
I'll take the second question first, especially, and I prefer the second question first, especially when I do these talks outside of the Arab world. I want to make it very clear that I believe misogyny has not disappeared anywhere, but I just believe that misogyny lies on a spectrum, and different countries lie on different positions on the spectrum. So obviously, I don't believe that misogyny or a hatred of women is exclusive to my part of the world. But what I was trying to do in that essay was to say, look, I don't want to waste my time by saying, oh, in America they do this, in France they do that, in Zimbabwe they do this, and in Egypt, because I'll never finish. And as an Egyptian and as a Muslim, I demand the right to be able to hold our men accountable. In the US, when I do US media and stuff, I criticize the Republicans, I criticize their religious right-wing lunatics. But I wanted this to be an opportunity, because these are revolutionary times, to talk about our men. And one of the, as I said...
Is there something special about your men, though, that is not evident in, say, violence against women in New Delhi or in remote parts of Indigenous Australia or in Heidelberg?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think what's unique to each of those situations is how each of those cultures marries whatever else is important enough to them with the culture and uses it against women. And in our particular scenario, it's a marriage of religion and culture to produce this very toxic environment that has basically left the Arab world at the bottom of every gender indices that are created. The World Economic Forum has created a global gender gap. Arab countries are at the bottom. The Thomson Reuters Foundation every year does the worst place to be a woman. Arab countries all the time score really badly. So I'm not making this up. Things are really bad. But obviously in every Arab country they're bad in a different way, because again, the Arab world isn't a monolith. I don't even like the word the Arab world. I call it the Middle East and North Africa. But for short terms, it's the Arab world. And so the other countries that have managed to kind of pull themselves up to the top level of the global gender index or the gap, obviously they've had a struggle that has created results that we now have to have. And that's why I'm saying these are revolutionary times. And where it became apparent in the revolution is we had women out on the street risking our lives just as the men did. But when we looked at our comrades, this very naive idea that just because a man has risked his life for a revolution, he's a feminist and not a misogynist is just ridiculous. Because clearly they are misogynists, because we continue to score so badly. And it really came to a head when... So I'm sitting there, this essay I wrote was the first thing I wrote after my casts were removed. My arms were in a cast for 3 months. And I'm looking at what has happened. I'm so angry about what happened to me, but I'm also looking at other women. So we had these so-called virginity tests in March of 2011. Very little outrage. And the women who had the courage to speak out were vilified and called liars for a very long time. And then what happened in Mohammed Mahmoud Street. And then the woman who was dragged through Tahrir Square, stripped down to her blue bra. To this day, we don't know her name, and to this day, her family prevents her from speaking out. She should be a revolutionary hero. She's an icon of the revolution. Her family has silenced her. Where was the rage? The rage was directed at a young woman called Alia al-Mahdi, who had the nerve to strip in her parents' living room and put a picture of herself naked on her blog. She didn't stage a naked protest on the streets of Cairo. It was on her blog. That naked picture created more rage than the virginity tests, the women attacked on Mohammed Mahmoud Street, and the woman dragged through Tahrir Square. So I'm sitting there thinking, what the hell is going on? This is a revolution. So what is going on is a certain sector of society, the regime and enough people on the street, recognize that we've reached a moment where women are going to be out of control, because we're out on the street shoulder to shoulder with them. And so they want to push us back now into the private, away from the public. And this is what this sexual violence is all about. Sexual violence is not exclusive to the Arab world. By no means am I suggesting that we're especially perverted towards women than other parts of the world. But we don't have the laws to protect women, and we don't have enough outrage against what happens to women. It's too accepted. And especially now, it's being used as a weapon, again, by the regime and the street, to push women out of the public space. And that's why I came up with this idea through the essay that I'm examining now in my book, that we began a political revolution that got rid of the Mubarak in the palace, or Ben Ali, or all the other dictators. But for that political revolution to succeed, it has to be met with a social and a sexual revolution that goes into the home to overthrow the Mubarak in the bedroom, in the living room, and in our mind. That's when the political revolution will succeed, because for us as women, we recognize the regime oppresses us and society oppresses us. So we have a double revolution. The men go out there and it's the regime they're fighting. At home, they're Mubarak. At home, I want to be as free as I want to be on the street.
So what can happen then in the home? I mean, I would... tough question, but I would think the home is a harder place for a revolution than even in politics. How do you do that? Where do you... It's simple in a way to say we need to build a movement and have educated women with passports and so on that are at the core of that. Mm-hmm. But how do you really permeate people's homes and values that are so entrenched?
Right. Well, just before I came to Australia, I spent about a week with a BBC producer making a 2-part radio documentary for the BBC World Service on women in the revolution. So we went to Jordan, we went to Tunisia, we interviewed women and girls in Egypt, and we also interviewed Libyan activists. So it's women from those 4 countries, and there's also a bit of input from Morocco. And in every one of those countries, I asked the girls and women, because I'm the presenter of this documentary, I asked them, what has the revolution done for you? And even for the girls and women who said the revolution has done nothing for me, or kind of overtly done nothing for me. So I would ask, well, has it changed anything? All of them said, the revolution has allowed me to say no, and the revolution has allowed me to express myself in ways I never could before. So this is where it started. Not all of them believed the revolution had reached home, but they believed that it was making enough inroads in their own mind, even if it hadn't yet translated into an actual no to either their fathers or their mothers. So I'll give you a few other examples. One of the reasons I chose to move back to Cairo was to be a bit more involved with women's issues on the ground. And about 3 months ago, I launched a support group for women. I think it's the first kind of support group for women in Egypt, at least. I don't know about other parts of the region, but I'm pretty sure for the whole region. And the reason that I launched this support group was because of my own post-traumatic stress disorder from my attack. Whenever the anniversary of my attack comes around, I totally fall apart. I can't sleep for days on end, and it's very distressing. So for 2 years in a row now, the anniversary would come around and I would fall apart, and I would wonder, what are those 12 other women going through? Each of us suffering in silence. So this group on the ground called the Egyptian Women's Union asked me to go and give a talk. And I said, I'm not going to lecture Egyptian women about sexual violence. They know about it. So let's have a discussion. So we have this discussion, and I love telling the story of how at the end of this discussion, this 19-year-old young woman stands up. She's wearing a headscarf. I used to wear a headscarf a long time ago. I wore one for 9 years. She stands up and she goes, I'm so angry. I have so much rage inside me. I'm just so angry. And it was really refreshing to hear about her anger. Because, usually women are taught to be nice, to be polite. That anger isn't ours. She was like, I'm so angry. My family doesn't take me seriously. They don't listen to me. I want to be independent. I don't like this headscarf. I want to take it off. My mother keeps threatening to lock me up at home. My dad has been beating me for years, but the physical beating isn't half as bad as the emotional abuse. Mona, do you think I should leave home? I was like, whoa. So I said to her, listen, I can't tell you what you must do. But I said to her, I think you know what you must do. And I think the reason that you're here is because you know what you must do. But for a woman of 19 to leave home in Egypt is almost impossible. Men and women live at home in Egypt until they get married. So what can you imagine what she has to traverse? Anyway, so I said, look, for women like you especially, I want to launch a support group, so please come. She stayed in touch with me for a few weeks and then disappeared. And I launched a support group, and the age group now is between 20 to 35. And then out of the blue, this young woman writes to me in the group, and she says, guess what? I've taken off my headscarf. And then she comes to the group. She's taken off her headscarf, and she goes, I left home. She did it. She somehow managed to have the wherewithal to leave home. And she sat and told us this story. And I interviewed the group, so I have their permission to tell you some of the stories with Gemma, the BBC producer. And she was telling Gemma her story sitting next to the 35-year-old woman in the group. She's the eldest after me. And the 35-year-old woman sat there and just was watching her. And she goes to her, just last year when I was 34, it was the first time in my life I traveled alone. And it was after a huge fight with my mother, who kept saying, you can't travel alone, but I did it. And she goes, and I'm watching you now. How did you do this? You're only 19. In that conversation, is what I'm talking about. The revolution has begun to cross the threshold.
It's a very inspiring story. How about, though, the lack of unity in Egypt and the Middle East and North Africa, let alone scholars from abroad who have attacked your essay and your views? How do you respond to that?
I've been called everything. I was telling you backstage, I've been called a colonial feminist, a native informant from inside. And from outside, I've been called an Islamo-fascist, Islamo-Nazi writer. So, I keep saying I'm going to get it on a T-shirt one of these days, that it's just going to be flooded with all the kind of slurs I've received. I'm fine. Call me whatever you like. I really don't care. Call me whatever you like. I've positioned myself intentionally out here, and I intentionally don't work with anyone because I don't want to sit in endless kind of well-meaning progressive groups that end up fighting with each other forever as the right wing take over the world. So I'm happy to work by myself and be alone, on this edge, and be called all these things. It's okay, because I believe that activism lies on this spectrum, and again, you have to choose your position on the spectrum. So if you don't want to be out here on the edge with me, and I insist on being on this edge because there are lunatics on the other edge, so we have to balance them out. So I'll be the lunatic on the good edge. So if you don't want to be out here with me, and it's okay, it's scary, because for a very long time I was very scared. I said I wore a headscarf for 9 years. It took me 8 years to take it off, because it's very difficult to challenge these kind of things. And I'm not suggesting that to be free or to be a revolutionary, you have to take off your headscarf. You have to figure out your own revolution, and that was one of my personal revolutions. Anyway, I'm out here in the hope that somewhere along the spectrum people say, well, I'm not as crazy as Mona. I'm not calling for what Mona wants, but I'm out here. So choose your position on the spectrum. And you don't have to agree with me. But when I was in Tunisia, I saw a wonderful example of people recognizing each other along that spectrum and using it for women's good. Because Tunisia, in unprecedented ways, has created the first constitution in the Arab world that has enshrined gender equality. It's not a perfect constitution, but they spent 2 years putting together this constitution. And at the time that my country wrote 2 really shitty constitutions, over 2 years, Tunisia took its time and created the first constitution in the Arab world that enshrines gender equality. How did they do that? They did this because the women in their constituent assembly, their parliament, in other words, were able to work across ideological and political lines. So I interviewed a secular activist, and I also interviewed for this BBC show a woman from Ennahda, which is their Islamist party. Now, I got to tell you, as an Egyptian, speaking to her, she wasn't an Islamist. She was just an ordinary Egyptian to me, but because she was conservative, but not as conservative as our Islamists, which is by way of saying that we're not all conservative in the same way. So this woman shows up to the interview with her husband and her 2 kids. She's wearing a headscarf. She struggled for years to wear a headscarf. She had the opposite of my struggle, because in Tunisia, women were not allowed to wear headscarves under the Ben Ali regime. So at university, she would wear a beret because she didn't want to show her hair. And then when she became a lawyer, she said she intentionally broke the law and wore headscarves. So she struggled in a different way, along a different path on that spectrum. And then she said when the elections after the fall of Ben Ali, she said her husband, who's also a lawyer, pushed her to become a politician, because he said to her, and this really is where the revolution begins at home. So this Islamist couple from Ennahda, the husband tells the wife, I want you to go into politics, because when you make it better for women, it will be better for everyone. You don't hear these kind of stories, And so she goes into the Constituent Assembly. Not all the women from Ennahda are feminist. Some of them were very opposed to the clause enshrining gender equality. And some of them were more feminist than others. And so this particular woman, she said, I worked with secular women because I recognize that when we fight as women, only the men benefit. I was like, please come to Egypt. We need someone to come and say that in Egypt. And so they did it. Now, the secular activist that I spoke to is an amazing young woman who created the first NGO of its kind that acts as a watchdog to politicians of all kinds. We never had this before. And I love telling her story of how, when she first started going to the Constituent Assembly to be this watchdog, one of the Salafi members of the Constituent Assembly, now Salafis are ultra-conservative Muslims, much more conservative than Ennahda, so much more to the right wing. She wanted to ask him a question, and this man just looked at her and said to her, because she dresses like me, he said to her, I'm not taking your question, I don't speak to naked women. And she said to him, naked, huh? I'll show you naked. And she began to undress. In the Constituent Assembly, she began, and he's like, stop. And he never, ever refused a question from her again. And so when they finally enshrined, they ended up, putting together this constitution, and they were crying and they were happy, the historical moment. Amira went and found this Salafi guy, and she said, I hugged him, and he hugged me back. I was like, well done. So this is the kind of unity that we're talking about. Call me whatever you want, I don't care. But I meet these women, and these women understand that, and we differ on so many other things. We don't have to be mirror images of each other. But when I hear an Islamist woman and a secular woman tell me in Tunisia, when we fight only men benefit, I'm like, that is it.
There's religion, the home, the apparatus of the state, but also the economy. And it doesn't get discussed, I don't think, as much as these other three as a contributor to women's status, well, everywhere in the world. Where does that fit in? What chance is there of a revolution where Egyptian girls, will go to school, get a job, be out in the world, visible,
right,
and earning coin, which is probably the greatest empowerment en masse that you could give.
No, absolutely.
To poor women.
The economy is crucial, definitely. And the economy in Egypt has taken a huge blow, and it's not kind to anyone right now. The informal economy in Egypt is mostly women-driven. So, they definitely have very little protections. We have at least 30% of Egyptian homes that are women-led. That is a home where the male breadwinner is just either missing in action, has abandoned his family, is unemployed, doesn't work for whatever reason, and it's the woman who brings in the money. So obviously, this idea that some of the ultra-conservatives were bandying around about how they wanted to change the curriculum to teach girls that they have to stay at home and boys be the breadwinner is la-la land. We can't afford to have just one breadwinner in the family. We need both, or whatever shape the family is in, because some families are single parents, some families are extended, some families are nuclear. But every family needs at least two breadwinners, if not more, and that's one of the reasons that a lot of children are put into employment, because their families can't afford otherwise. In both Tunisia and in Egypt, for this radio show, we went to huge working class neighborhoods to see what life was like for the women there. Because unless the revolution goes into those working class neighborhoods, we're just going to sit here and talk about it as an elite thing, that we discuss in Melbourne and London, and it means nothing to these women. And especially the working class neighborhood in Egypt that we went to, and what the women told us really hit home here. Because side by side with the economy is women's safety. Because you can't leave your home to go to work if you feel unsafe. And the epidemic of street sexual harassment that we have in Egypt is a problem for everybody. The lack of police presence, and now the police is a sinister body as far as I'm concerned. I don't want them interfering in my business. That's unfortunately what they focus on. What they're not doing is doing their job, and that is keeping the streets safe. So a lot of people have said to me, I've stopped sending my girls especially to school because they're not safe. And one of the women in this working class neighborhood in Egypt told us that there isn't even a police station in this huge working class neighborhood. And a few nights before we went to interview them, there was a shooting. She said, we couldn't tell if it was drug dealers or what was happening or gang violence. And we called the police, and they didn't come until hours later just to see who killed who. And the women don't feel safe on the streets of this neighborhood. We couldn't go in until someone came from this NGO that provides services for girls and women to escort us in and to escort us out. So all of this plays a role in women's ability to work. And obviously, you need to have your own money. But, even when women do earn their own money, and now this cuts across now, working class women, middle class women, upper middle class women, you're still contending with a culture that continues to teach you that the man is the head of the household. Even women who make their own money and who are highly educated still too often think this. So you can imagine the multiple levels of pressures on working class women. But I have to add that so many of the protests had huge numbers of working class girls and women in them, basically because they're the group with nothing to lose. They have nothing. They're the bottom of every hierarchy you can imagine in Egypt. They receive the least education, the least safety, the least concern, and nobody talks about them. And there's a woman, God bless her, without whom my life would not be possible, who's the housekeeper who comes to my house once a week. She did not receive any kind of formal education. She has not been able to afford to educate her girls, even though we have free education in Egypt. But how free is free? She can't afford to buy them books or a uniform, and doesn't feel safe sending them, so they're at home all the time. And we'll talk about the revolution every now and then, and it means nothing to her. And when I go visit her, because I've been to her neighborhood, because there was some stuff that I was helping her with, you drive through these horrendous roads and you look around and you think, this is the biggest crime of the Mubarak regime, that it left people living like this. It left them in this desperate state because it understood that all their energy goes into survival and very little is left over to opposition.
We will have some audience questions. Have we got roving mics? Yeah, if you'd like to ask Mona a question, put your hand up and somebody will bring a microphone to it. Tell us, while we're doing that, just put your hand up, a bit more about the lives of these working class women.
Well, we had great conversations about things that I thought at first, should I even ask these questions? But we wanted to get to basically when Morsi was still president, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafi movement had said that they wanted to remove the minimum age of marriage in Egypt and to decriminalize female genital mutilation, which has been against the law since 2008 in Egypt. So we got talking to these women about child marriage and FGM, or genital cutting. And there was this wonderful moment where I had a woman in the room who was about 65 and a woman who was 35. And both the women had been cut when they were children. And the woman who was 65 insisted that this was the right thing to do. She'd done it to her daughter, and she was expecting her daughter to do it to her daughters. She couldn't care less that it had been criminalized and that it was against the law. And just a week before, actually, for the first time in Egyptian history, a father and a doctor were put on trial, or they were about to be put on trial for the death of a 13-year-old girl last year in a clinic. And this is really worrying, the medicalization of FGM. So the 65-year-old woman was just fine with it. It was not going to stop. And this speaks to how ingrained it is in so many classes in Egypt, because it happens among educated and more affluent people too. The 35-year-old said, no, this is something that must stop. And if I had daughters, I would not do it to them. And then I wanted to ask them about sex. So I said, okay, this is a bit sensitive and you don't have to answer if you want. But it was silly. They answered everything. And I said, so has it affected your sex life at all? Because I had a woman in the women's support group who, just before the International Day of Zero Tolerance to FGM, we were talking about it. For most of the women in the group, it was a theoretical thing. And then she said, I had this done to me. Against my mother's wishes, my grandfather, she was visiting Egypt, her family lived abroad, and her mother was out shopping. And her grandfather did it to her when she was 8. And this is why when people say, why do mothers do it to their daughters? This is the wrong question to ask. It's not about why mothers do it to their daughters. It's how much power do mothers have to fight a society that tells them this is what should happen to girls and women. So we need to handle this holistically and stop going to basically the weakest link in this and putting the blame on mothers. This is society. This isn't mothers. So this young woman, she says, I had this done to me when I was 8, and am I normal? Am I going to be okay? She hadn't had sex. She was waiting to be married to have sex, because you're taught you must remain a virgin until you get married. So I'm like the resident sex expert for them, because I'm 46, I've been married, I'm very open about my sexuality. So it's like, and sometimes they call me Dr. Mona. So it's like, Dr. Mona. So I had a very honest conversation with her where I said to her, listen, the clitoris is the tip of an iceberg, and the nerve endings, they're the main part of it. And, I hope you marry a very patient man, because then, he will understand how to please you and how to give you pleasure. So with these two women in the working class neighborhood now, I said, so has it affected your sex life? And because I want to take this to the woman in my group. And they both giggled and said, no, we've been just fine. And the 35-year-old said to me, I often wondered if it was affecting my ability to orgasm. It just takes me a bit longer because I talk to my friends at work. And, we've discussed this and they just get there quicker. But, I come too. And I was like, okay, I'm really happy.
I just wanted to ask, relating to you, how did you deal with your brothers and your father and your grandfather?
Thank you for that question, because often some of the pushback I get for the essay is, my dad doesn't hate me, my brother doesn't hate me. And I'm like, it's not about your daddy, it's not about your brother, it's about a society out there that has made lives very different for your male family members and you. I'm very lucky in that I have, my parents met in medical school, and because of free education in Egypt, they got the Nasser instituted in the 1950s. The government in Egypt for a very long time has given grants for people to study abroad, and so my parents were given a government grant that allowed both of them to get a PhD in medicine. So I've grown up in a home where I'm exceptionally lucky in that I've seen both my parents working the same thing, they're both doctors, in a very egalitarian home. And they brought my brother and I, and then much later, because my sister is 19 years younger than me, from the same parents, they brought us up with this egalitarian idea of education is very important. But I was taught by these same parents that I shouldn't travel alone as a woman. And I didn't travel by myself until I was 27. My brother was never told you can't travel alone, but he never traveled alone anyway. So it ended up being I'm the one who traveled alone everywhere, but he didn't because he didn't want to. So I've had a mix of this very egalitarian home, but my parents are also products of that culture. So I was told you can't travel alone, and there were certain things that I couldn't do as a girl that I ended up fighting. So I'm very lucky to have that, but I know that for my parents, you know, I worry them deeply, and I've broken and smashed their hearts over and over with the kind of fears and concerns I give them, especially when I was attacked. But I know that they probably struggle much more when I write and speak about sex than when I write about the Mubarak regime or Sisi or, you know, the politics. Because again, we're products of our culture. You're not supposed to talk about sex openly. And to see their daughter write an essay, as I did at the beginning of 2011, just before the revolution began, writing about virginity and saying that I had sex before I got married, it was very painful for them and very difficult for them. And it created a family crisis that took us a while to get over. Because even though I'm sure they knew, it's not a subject for a dinner conversation. And now everybody knows because Mona's posted it on Facebook and Twitter, and all the uncles and aunts know, even if they all know that Mona's the crazy one. But what's happened in my family now is, because my mother is one of 11 and my dad is one of 8, so we have like a mini Egypt comprised of my cousins. And we get together at dinner sometimes, and my younger cousins in their early 20s, you know, one wants to be a football player, one travelled by herself when she was 20. And I'm sitting there watching these young men and women going, this is it, you know, like the 35-year-old who watched the 19-year-old. And every now and then they'll say to me, Mona, you know the family thinks you're crazy, right? And I go, yeah, I know. And they go, but because you did this crazy stuff, it's what we do isn't considered half as crazy. So it's kind of, you know, thank you. And I was like, I didn't do it for you guys. I did it because I was just so angry at these things that we were told were normal, you know? So my dad, this is also by way of saying, my dad is not a violent man, and neither is my brother. So when I say this misogyny is very violent, I'm obviously talking about a societal system that makes it okay for men to be violent. It's not about my dad. But there are too many Egyptian dads who feel compelled to put a curfew on their daughter. And I always ask these girls who say, my dad does this because he loves me and is protecting me. Who is he protecting you against? Other people's brothers and fathers who in the public arena are not these loving, gentle men who at home, you know, love us. So, and this is what we have to dismantle. What happens to these men when they leave the home, but also what they do to us at home in the name of our culture and our religion. I love my dad and he loves me, but there are cultural things that we have to wrestle with together.
Yes, you're speaking a lot about the activities of revolution and your interactions in Cairo. Can you speak a little bit about what's going on in the other areas in Egypt, the other towns, major towns, but also the country down the valley?
Sure. I mean, I'm from Cairo, so most of my interactions have been in Cairo. But the revolution was definitely not limited to Cairo. I mean, it was in Suez, it was in Port Said, it was in Alexandria. So, and I spent some time in Alexandria, and I marched in several protests in Alexandria. But again, Alexandria is a big city, so I'm guessing you're wondering about the smaller towns and the villages especially. In many villages, the revolution has not arrived. It hasn't, by virtue of many things: education, poverty, distance, and basically, and that also speaks to the centralization of so many things in Egypt. Oh, because of 60 years of military rule. For 60 years, Cairo told Egypt what is a good Egyptian, what is a good Muslim, whose life is right and whose life is wrong. But that is slowly also being dismantled. And I can't speak to for example, the Nubian community, because I know many activists from the Nubian community in Egypt who are from southern Egypt. For a very long time, they were completely marginalized and their culture ignored and their language ignored because they speak an oral language and that wasn't taught in school, so it's considered a dying language. And when Egypt built the high dam, a lot of their villages were destroyed in order to make room for the high dam. And even though a lot of the artifacts were rebuilt, those villages were not rebuilt. So that centralized authority in Egypt owes the Nubian community a great deal, which it has not, repaid. But a lot of my Nubian friends, when the revolution began what in the United States we call a hyphenated existence. They began to say, like, I say I'm Egyptian American. They began to say, I'm Nubian Egyptian. And they understood that part of what the revolution's power and beauty was dismantling this centralization. To say that, I'm in this square, wherever I am in Egypt, as an Egyptian standing up to the regime, but also saying I'm a Nubian whose cultural background has been ignored. And I demand this now to be put on the table. So they've put together their own NGO called the Youth Nubian Movement, something like that. And they have a presence. And when the constitution was being written, they tried to put pressure on the constituent committee. So that's just one example. But obviously there's so much poverty in the countryside in Egypt. And that is what allows a lot of the political parties, be it the Muslim Brotherhood movement or the Mubarak regime remnants or others, to go in there and use food and money to buy votes. Because you're talking about desperate poverty here, where you give people gas cylinders and some meat and say, vote for me, and they will, because they've been ignored for such a long time. So that, again, is part of the reason why I say we need at least a decade, because we need to make inroads in those areas where, because of this system of patronage, the votes just go kind of, knee-jerk reaction to those who form either the Mubarak regime remnants or the Islamist movements, because they're the ones who know how to use these tokens to buy votes, basically.
I wonder if you spend a moment talking about the minority groups in Egypt after the revolution, such as the Coptic Christians.
Yes. Coptic Christians have always been discriminated against in Egypt. This is not a new thing. The Mubarak regime, the sad thing about life, again, and this goes back to what I was talking about, the centralization of Egyptianness, is the Mubarak regime would always present itself as, I'm the sane alternative to the crazy lunatic Islamists. And it would do this with our Coptic community, while at the same time turning a blind eye to almost annual attacks several times a year against the Coptic community that were never taken to court, that were never held accountable. And so those who attacked the community acted with impunity. So where, even though Mubarak claimed he was the protector of everyone, was this protection for the community? It wasn't there. So this discrimination goes way back. It's not new. But what the Coptic community understood was that it had to, and continues to have to, choose between, the devil you know and the devil you don't know. The rock, the devil in the deep blue sea, basically. But what began to change when the revolution began was that young Copts especially, who refused to be silent and quiet and just kind of don't be involved in politics, which for a long time they were taught by the church this as a way to protect themselves, and it was a survival mechanism. They began to break away from that and said, no, we're Egyptians too, and we're going to protest. And they paid a high price for this. In October of 2011, a massacre occurred in front of the TV and radio building of mostly Christians. The Maspero massacre, it's called. And it was an attack against a protest by Christians and others who supported them against the burning of a church in southern Egypt. And also, just before the revolution began, there was a bombing in a church in Alexandria, the St. Mark's Church, I think it was called. So there have been consistent attacks against the Coptic minority. Very few people are held accountable for those attacks. The government, the regime doesn't defend them. The regime made it so difficult to be a Christian in Egypt, you couldn't even change a tap or a doorknob in a church without getting security clearance. So, Mubarak was no friend to the Copts. So obviously when the Muslim Brotherhood got more and more into prominence, naturally our Coptic community was very worried, because now you're talking about the Islamists who don't care about any other religious group. So it was definitely a concern, and especially from the Salafi groups, who were the more ultra-conservative ones, because there were more and more attacks on the Coptic community, from the Salafis, again in an environment where the police were not doing their jobs. So the one positive thing, to take it back to what the young Copts that I mentioned earlier, is that I'm seeing more and more younger Christians taking part in street protests, saying it's my right to protest. And even though the Coptic Pope came out recently and said, vote for Sisi, which many of my Christian friends thought was a mistake because he recognizes him as some kind of protector against the Islamists, be it the Brotherhood or the Salafis, I'm hoping what is happening with the Nubian community is also happening with the Christian community of Egypt, where they recognize the regime protects no one but itself. And that you have to, and all of us have to go out there and risk everything we have to recognize that only we protect our rights by bringing to bear pressure on a regime that only cares about its own interests.
I've been so excited to be here since you tweeted about it a few months ago, so I'm very excited actually. Yeah. I'm currently doing my postgraduate study in international relations, focusing on the MENA region. And as a feminist myself, I'm naturally interested in women's rights, particularly in the MENA region. I was just wondering if you had any advice for someone like myself or anyone in the room who's interested in actively, standing with Arab women. Generally, the criticism you get, especially as a Western woman, interested in such an area is difficult. I was just interested in seeing what you would do.
I mean, there are two ways to approach this. If you're living here, my advice whenever someone asks me how can I best help you all over there is to push back against the misogyny in your own community, because it does lie on a spectrum, and there's no country on earth that is post-feminist. This is an illusion. There's no post-feminism, there's no post-racism.
Mona, we are not doing very well here. No. I don't know how much you know, but...
Your Prime Minister is women's minister, and apparently he's a feminist. He has 3 daughters.
Indeed he is.
You need a revolution, Sally.
We've got fewer females, I think, than Tunisia.
That's sad. I'm happy to help in any way I can.
I need you to come and live here. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, but this is exactly it, there are problems over there, definitely, but we're taking care of them. We're handling them. We're paying the price for handling them. You have problems over here. And that's honestly, that's how I think you can best help, because it lies on a spectrum. Fight your fight here. See us fighting our fight over there and recognize that this is a global struggle. That's why I always talk about the Republicans in the US, because I'm an Egyptian American. I travel back and forth. In the US, I tell them you're the religious right-wing lunatics here, and I have religious right-wing lunatics in Egypt. And the line that I always like to tell them is, you're all obsessed with my vagina. Stay out of my vagina unless I want you in there. And that's all they want to do, Just focus on what we do with our vaginas. So here, focus on your right-wing lunatics and anyone who's a misogynist. If you want to do something in the region itself, if you have some months that you can take off, I know a lot of the women's groups on the ground take interns. And there's been several women who've written to me and said, I've asked, how can I help? And I've put them, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with activists I know. And they'll take you on as an intern, and you can help them, in their own data collection or in the workshops that they run. There are groups that do everything from workshops on how to fight street sexual harassment, going out on the street and handing out flyers. They do workshops on masculinity and deconstructing kind of toxic notions of masculinity, because they recognize that femininity and masculinity are social constructs. And if we're talking about revolutionary times, let's talk about what it means to be a man. And do you want to be this man who, whenever I leave my house now, it's a war zone? I know a lot of Egyptian men who say, I don't want to be that man. So there's lots of groups on the ground who are working on these things. If you want to take some months off to be an intern, I'd be happy to connect you to them. Fight the fight everywhere.
Mona, do you have any plans to go into politics?
God, no. I'm really conflicted about this, actually, because a lot of people say to me, but that's so selfish and so irresponsible, and you keep saying that we need to fix it, we need to create alternatives.
To do it or not to do it?
Not to do it. Because you keep saying about the alternatives, we have no alternatives, then go in there and get involved in the mess. So I recognize that I'm one of the many people who say we need better alternatives, and we're not providing them ourselves directly. But at the same time, I'm also cognizant of the fact that I like this place on the lunatic fringe, and that to get into politics, I have to compromise, and I don't like compromise. And so I'd much rather be like that woman, Amira, who was stripping in the parliament, to hold those inside accountable. So, and I'm very conflicted about change from the inside. I'm not really sure if it's possible. But obviously, we need to fight for it in Egypt. So for now, I want to be on the outside and just push and provoke as much as I can in the hope that the spectrum opens up for more and more people. But maybe one of these days I'll take the plunge, but I don't know how many people would vote for me in Egypt. Maybe my sister and brother.
Look, we'll take one more really quick one. We are fast running out of time. Famous last thing this, they say never get the last question when you're right on time.
Thank you. Thanks, Mona, and really it's a great opportunity to see someone from the Middle East and to talk about this subject. But I was waiting to say something about, for you to say something about Nawal Saadawi. I mean, to me, she used to be my hero.
Yes.
And the other thing is just I want to clarify, not every Muslim is Arab and not every Arab is Muslim. I mean, that is very, very important, sort of thing. And what do you think of Hamdeen Sabahi?
Okay, you're going to do very quick.
Okay.
Because there's 3 questions there.
Yes. This is exactly why I don't like saying the Arab world, because it gives this idea of a monolith. That's why I said I prefer Middle East and North Africa. Nawal Saadawi and a whole host of other women, I think, are definitely part of our heritage. And whenever I'm asked a question about feminism and aren't you just exporting feminism from the West, my answer usually is it's been in our heritage for a very long time. In 1923, Hoda Sha'rawi launched the first modern feminist movement. Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I thought you were. I claim you as an honorary Egyptian. No, in 1923, for me, as an Egyptian, that is part of my heritage. Hoda Sha'rawi launched the modern feminist movement in Egypt. She removed a headscarf back then and said, this is a thing of the past. 1954, another feminist hero of mine, Doré Shafit, stormed the Egyptian parliament with 1,500 women demanding women's right to vote, which they got 2 years later. And Nawal Saadawi is part of that long heritage of feminists who are of the culture and of that faith background, despite their different relationship, because I don't think Nawal Saadawi uses her birth as a Muslim or doesn't identify as a Muslim as for her feminism. So yes, we have all these women and it's important to remember them. What you were saying about, Hamdeen Sabahi is the other question. I'm trying to remember all your questions and cognizant of the fact that we're about to finish. Hamdeen Sabahi has a long track record of working in politics in Egypt and won several parliamentary elections in his district. He probably will be the only person opposing Sisi when we have our presidential elections in May. I don't think he will win. I'm pretty sure that Sisi will win. What I wish Hamdeen Sabahi had done in our presidential elections in 2012 was got together with one of the other candidates, because if they had, they probably would have been president and avoided this whole...
He came third, didn't he?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Morsi got 25% in the first round, Hamdeen Sabahi got 19%. If Hamdeen had got together with another candidate, we could have avoided this Morsi-Sisi thing, you know? So Hamdeen has a long track record. His socialism is a bit out of date and out of touch with a lot of leftists I know in Egypt right now. But for me, personally, I think his socialism is too connected to the military, which I don't like.
Mona, thank you so much. I'm sure everybody could have sat for many more hours. We've just touched the surface of so many important things and gone a bit deeper into others. Wonderful to meet you, wonderful to have you here. And even better, though, to know that you are trotting around those streets of Egypt and elsewhere, stirring up your particular brand of trouble. It's great to meet you, and thank you so much for coming here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.